380,000 kilometers of icy, utterly hostile void. Outside, temperatures swing wildly, from a scorching 120 degrees in the sun to a freezing 150 below in the shadows. There are no escape pods, no backup ships, no way to call for help. This is absolute hopelessness. On Earth, if a submarine sinks, there's always a tiny, faint chance for a rescue. If a plane crashes, survivors might endure a rough landing. But here, at the bottom of another celestial body's gravity well, the rules change completely. Two people sit inside a sharp-edged metal box, its walls no thicker than several layers of heavy paper. This box stands on four legs in the middle of an endless gray desert, covered in sharp, glass-like dust. Around it stretches a ringing vacuum. The only way back home, the only ticket to Earth's atmosphere, is a piece of metal hidden just beneath the floor of their tiny cabin. The engine. The iron heart of the lunar module. Everything depends on it. If it fires up, the astronauts will return to orbit, dock with the command module, and head for Earth. But if it falters, fails to produce enough thrust, or simply stays silent, they will remain in that gray dust forever. There is no backup plan, no redundant system. The stakes rise to the limits where orbital mechanics meet the raw, primal terror of endless space. Two men set out to the surface of another world inside a craft made of foil. They put their lives in the hands of a single machine, one no one had ever tested in real conditions until the very moment of launch. Today, you'll discover how the brilliant design of that primitive onboard computer saved the Apollo 11 mission just seconds before disaster. Step by step, we'll trace the chain of fatal decisions that destroyed the Soviet lunar program in a series of 4 catastrophic explosions. You'll also learn why engineers deliberately stripped the lunar module of seats and heavy armor. And the biggest question, why did the very first autonomous flight behind the far side of the moon, where Earth signals vanish completely, become the key to saving the entire space program? The Apollo ascent engine stands as a monument to one of the harshest engineering compromises in human history. Here's the fact. The Apollo ascent engine had no backup system, no redundant circuit, no second engine ready to take over if the first failed. Aviation never works that way. Every commercial airliner carries at least 2 engines, duplicate hydraulics, and spare generators. But the lunar module answered only to the ruthless law of the rocket equation. Take a typical car trip, for example. You fill the tank, but the weight of that gas hardly slows you down. Rockets don't work like that. To send 1 pound of useful cargo into orbit, you need tens of pounds of fuel, and that fuel itself adds weight. They needed more fuel just to lift the fuel itself. It was a vicious cycle. Every extra pound on the moon meant tons of additional propellant waiting on the launch pad in Florida. Engineers became obsessed with cutting weight wherever they could. They removed the seats. Astronauts stood strapped in by harnesses. They made the cabin walls so thin that a dropped screwdriver could punch right through the hull. When it came to the engine, the solution was startlingly simple. A second engine added too much weight, so the first one had to be absolutely 100% reliable. Engineers scrapped complex ignition systems with spark plugs and turbo pumps. They went with hypergolic propellants, Aerozine 50 and nitrogen tetroxide. These are extremely toxic, fiercely corrosive liquids, yet they have one incredible trait. The moment they touch each other, they ignite instantly, spontaneously. No sparks needed, no starters. Just 2 valves that must open at the exact same time. Compressed helium pushes the liquids into the combustion chamber, where they mix and explode, producing thrust. It sounds reliable, but here's the chilling truth. This very simplicity hides a deadly risk. If even 1 valve jams from a tiny grain of lunar dust, if the helium pressure drops by even a fraction of a percent, the reaction stalls. The engine won't start, and 2 people will slowly suffocate inside a cramped cabin, staring out at a distant blue planet suspended in the black sky. That awareness weighed heavily not only on the crew, but also on the people back on Earth. The psychological strain on the engineers pushed human endurance to its limits. The astronauts spent 22 hours on the moon before liftoff. 22 long hours. They stepped onto the surface, collected rocks, set up instruments, and photographed the landscape. Then they returned to the cabin, peeled off their spacesuits coated with stubborn, gunpowder-scented lunar dust, and tried to sleep right on top of the ascent engine casing. Meanwhile, in Houston and contractor labs, a quiet kind of chaos unfolded. The tension was unbearable. 22 hours without sleep or food for the engine's creator. The person who designed that system sat glued to telemetry screens, understanding every microscopic detail of the mechanism. He knew every weld, every gasket, every millimeter of the fuel lines. He understood that nearly 250,000 miles away, the metal of his engine faced extreme temperatures in the vacuum of space. There was nothing he could do. No repair crew to send with a wrench. All he could do was wait. And that wait drove him insane, turning every second into a physical torment. This level of stress would have been unbearable if Apollo hadn't prepared for it in advance, testing the very idea of total isolation. Long before Neil Armstrong left his mark in the dust, another crew stepped into the unknown. Apollo 8 became the first to experience autonomous control without any contact with Earth. That mission changed everything. The spacecraft headed to the moon to enter its orbit, but celestial mechanics have their own rules. To slow down and stay in orbit, the ship had to fire its main engine. And that maneuver always happens at the exact moment the spacecraft passes behind the far side of the moon. A massive rocky sphere, 3,500 kilometers wide, completely blocks all radio signals. It feels like total isolation on the far side of the moon, cut off from Houston. In mission control, the telemetry screens fade into a flat, gray static. The speakers emit only a muffled hiss of static electricity. No one on Earth knows what's happening aboard the spacecraft. No one can send commands or fix errors. The crew faces the infinite alone. Picture this moment. Astronaut Lovell, his finger hovering over the maneuver confirmation button in the silent void of space. Around him, the vacuum's absolute cold seeps into the bones. Inside the cabin, only the hum of life support fans and his own steady breathing break the silence. He watches the control panel. The computer counts down the seconds until the engine fires. If the engine runs too briefly, they won't be caught by the moon's gravity. They'll drift off into deep space with no way back. But if the engine burns too long, they'll crash into the lunar surface. Lovell presses the button. The engine roars to life. Vibrations ripple through the entire craft. They're doing this alone, putting full trust in the autopilot and their training, while Earth holds its breath, waiting for them to emerge from behind the moon's shadow. This moment of complete autonomy, of relying on the machine at the edge of human reach, laid the groundwork for all future lunar landings. This foundation stood the test. All 6 landing missions succeeded. 6 times the lunar module touched down on the surface. 6 times astronauts spent long hours amid dust and vacuum. And 6 times the single non-redundant ascent engine fired perfectly. This is what happens at lunar liftoff. The astronaut presses a button. Pyrotechnic bolts explode with a deafening bang that travels only through the metal hull, severing the connection between the descent and ascent stages. A guillotine cuts the cables. Valves open. Hypergolic fuel ignites in the combustion chamber. In the vacuum, no air holds the flame back, so the exhaust instantly spreads out in a wide, almost invisible fan. The launch stage bounces above the landing pad at liftoff, then shoots sharply upward. Golden foil bursts apart in a silent explosion. The lower part of the module stays behind, forever resting on the surface as a monument to human daring. Meanwhile, the upper cabin, carrying 2 astronauts, races into the black sky, accelerating toward the moon's first cosmic velocity. This is engineering at its finest, a triumph of math and chemistry over the chaos of the universe. The engine performed flawlessly, turning what could have been a shared grave into a victorious chariot. No matter how reliable the hardware, it's lifeless without the mind that controls it. A perfect engine is useless if it fires a second too late, or cuts out a fraction too early. Hypergolic fuel guarantees ignition every time, but it doesn't know where to go. When time and fuel run on a razor's edge, measured in milliseconds, human reflexes just can't keep up. Astronauts couldn't manually adjust thrust or calculate orbital vectors on the fly while being pinned to their seats by G-forces. They needed a brain, an electronic computer ready to take control at the critical moment. A system that could process data from radars, gyroscopes, and accelerometers, and send flawless commands to the engine's valves. That brain sat right in front of them, built into the control panel. But how did this primitive calculator from the 1960s, with just 4 kilobytes of memory, manage to steer the most powerful rocket ever built, and save the mission in the chaos of the moment? Take a typical musical greeting card from the supermarket. You open the thick, glossy cardboard, and a tiny speaker hidden between the layers starts playing a simple melody. Inside that cardboard lies a microchip no bigger than a grain of rice. This cheap little piece of silicon, destined to be tossed in the trash tomorrow along with the wrapping, packs hundreds of times more computing power than the entire space program of the 1960s. It sounds like an exaggeration, a catchy metaphor, but the facts don't lie. The onboard computer had just 4 kilobytes of memory. Only 4. To grasp that scale, pull out your smartphone and snap a single photo. One quick tap on the screen, that image alone weighs 1,000 times more than all the memory in the machine controlling the interplanetary spacecraft. Engineers had to cram absolutely everything into a tiny 4 kilobytes. Orbital mechanics, navigation, life support systems, radar data, and pinpoint thrust calculations. Every byte counted. Every line of code was crafted with obsessive precision. Programmers fought for every character, cutting unnecessary commands and trimming formulas down to bare essentials. At a time when computers filled entire university floors and needed powerful cooling, the idea of fitting an electronic brain into a flying capsule seemed insane. Machines back then ran on fragile vacuum tubes, prone to overheating and failure. Yet this device had to withstand temperature swings, radiation, and intense shaking. Against all odds, engineers built it, transforming what we thought was possible in computing. The computer weighed 32 kilograms, about the size and weight of a sturdy travel suitcase, packed tight with metal and electronics. Inside this golden box hid the most unusual memory architecture in history. No silicon chips, no magnetic disks, no flash drives. The memory was physical, in the truest sense. At a factory in Massachusetts, a vast, bright workshop lit by powerful lamps. Dozens of women sat at long tables, former textile and watch factory workers skilled in fine manual tasks. Before them stretched rows of tiny magnetic rings, each no bigger than a pinhead. They held special thin needles threaded with the finest copper wire. They weren't just assembling electronics, they were literally stitching software by hand. Threading copper wire through a ring, that was a single bit. They wove the circuits around the outside, leaving the center empty. That was the 0. For months, 8 hours a day, in silence broken only by the clinking of metal, they braided algorithms into thick copper strands. One wrong move, one missed loop, and the ship orbiting the moon would crash into the rocks. The program took on a tangible form. You could hold that code in your hands, feel its weight, the cold metal, trace your fingers along the wires. And here's the thing. This primitive technology made the computer invincible. A modern flash drive could be wiped out by a magnetic field or a power surge. But the lunar code was woven from copper and iron. Radiation pierced the ship. Solar storms pounded the hull. Yet those physically intertwined zeros and ones stayed put. The program couldn't be erased or altered mid-flight. It was as solid as granite. But this iron brain would have been useless if people couldn't communicate with it. Engineers faced another massive challenge. Imagine yourself floating in empty space. You're wearing a heavy spacesuit. The gloves are stiff, swollen from pressure. Your fingers lose feeling. Every movement demands effort. In front of you lies the main control panel. No screens with graphics, no joysticks or cursors, just dim green numbers glowing against a black background and a massive keyboard with huge buttons. To make the machine work, pilots had to learn a new artificial language. The input interface called verb-noun. It was brilliantly simple but brutally strict. The verb and noun buttons felt like learning a foreign language, requiring ironclad discipline. The rules were strict. The verb meant the machine's action. Calculate, display, launch. The noun was the target. Altitude, speed, angle, time. Here's an example. You need to find the flight's altitude. You don't look for a dial. Instead, you press the heavy verb button, hearing a deep click. Then you enter the code 16, the command to show data continuously. Next, you hit noun and type in 68, the distance to the target. The machine instantly understands this digital phrase. The blinking code display in the cramped cockpit was the pilot's only window to reality. Outside lay total darkness, or blinding light, where the eye could no longer judge distance. The astronauts repeated these commands hundreds of times, cross-checking with notebooks on their laps. It was an ongoing mathematical conversation. A single wrong digit could send the engine spinning the wrong way. They exchanged short, clipped codes, like speaking to a powerful entity without intuition. And this entity obeyed without question, as long as the conditions stayed normal. The real test of the system's genius came when everything went sideways. Error 1202 during the Apollo 11 landing. This moment went down in history as the ultimate showdown between human and machine. 15 kilometers above a cratered plane, the lunar module was plummeting fast. Speed was terrifying. Fuel burned away at an alarming rate. The computer pushed to its limit, just 4 kilobytes, reading data from gyroscopes, calculating thrust, adjusting angles. Inside the cabin, the steady hum of fans filled the air. Then, sharp and piercing, the siren screamed in the headset. A yellow warning light blazed on the panel. The main alarm. 4 digits lit up the display. 1202. At that instant, the commander's pulse soared to 150 beats per minute. What did this code mean? A fatal overload warning. Due to a hardware conflict, the radar, designed solely for orbital docking, suddenly started flooding the computer with tens of thousands of false signals every second. The tiny 32-kilogram brain began drowning in a torrent of digital noise. The task queue overflowed. Imagine your powerful laptop facing a similar crisis. You open 100 heavy programs, start rendering, launch games. What happens? The system freezes completely. The screen locks up, forcing a reboot that takes minutes. On Earth, that's just an annoyance. But 15 kilometers above the moon, those minutes translate into an inevitable crash, hurtling into rocky cliffs at cannonball speed. But the computer from the 60s, pieced together by skilled women weaving copper wires, acted differently. The programmers who wrote its code anticipated that amid the chaos of flight, the machine could drown in a flood of data. So, they taught it how to survive. When it detected a critical overload, the computer didn't freeze or shut down. Instead, it made a deliberate, programmed choice. It instantly wiped its memory clean of secondary tasks. It simply ignored the data from the malfunctioning radar. It turned off updates to some displays. It shed everything unnecessary and focused all its resources on one goal: keeping the spacecraft steady and controlling the engine thrust. It rebooted in fractions of a second, picked up data exactly where it left off, and continued guiding the module down. Back at Mission Control on Earth, engineers froze in horror when they saw error code 1202. They had only seconds to decide: abort the landing or carry on. They chose to continue because they realized the computer hadn't failed. It was fighting to keep the ship alive. This one-of-a-kind fail-safe design saved the mission just moments before the astronauts would have reached for the abort button. The machine proved smarter than the circumstances. This heavy box, packed with copper coils, proved humanity's triumph over the chaos of the universe. It was a masterpiece of human intelligence, compressed into the size of a small suitcase. Yet, no matter how brilliant or reliable this electronic mind was, it remained just a passenger. To let these 4,000 bytes calculate trajectories over the moon's craters, they first had to break free from the grasp of Earth's gravity. And that demanded a raw, primal, brutally fierce force. A force nothing like delicate copper wires, elegant algorithms, or the quiet glow of green digits. The ship's brain thrived in the silent chill of space. But its body, the one it was attached to at launch, was something else entirely. A towering giant, as tall as a 36-story building, packed to the brim with thousands of tons of explosive liquid. The launch rocket wasn't just a vehicle, it was a controlled explosion on a colossal scale, ready to erupt at the slightest spark. So how did this fragile electronic mind, and the 2 humans sealed inside a thin-walled cabin, survive those first terrifying minutes, when beneath them detonated the most monstrous machine humanity had ever built? This is the Saturn V. It stands 111 meters tall. That's as high as a 36-story skyscraper. But unlike a building resting firmly on a concrete foundation, it balances on its own tail, right in the middle of the launch pad. Look up. The top of this giant disappears into the morning haze. It weighs 3,000 tons, about the same as a small freight train, or an entire fleet of heavy ships stacked into a single vertical column. And all this crushing weight has to not just lift off the ground, but accelerate fast enough to punch through the planet's invisible yet incredibly dense gravitational shield. 3,000 tons sounds like a massive number, but the rocket hardly contains any solid monolithic parts. It's not a solid chunk of cast steel. At its core, it's a giant, incredibly thin-walled metal sphere, packed to the brim with explosive liquid. Kerosene and liquid oxygen boil inside the tanks, chilling the outer shell so much that heavy ice chunks form from the moist air. The rocket groans and creaks, shedding these ice masses in huge slabs before a single mechanism even starts moving. You stand at the base of this tower watching white steam billow from the pressure release valves. And suddenly, one thing becomes clear. This isn't a vehicle. It's a massive controlled bomb, ready to unleash energy comparable to a small nuclear blast. The metal shell strains to its limit, holding back a storm that's on the verge of breaking free. At the very top of this ticking volcano, inside a tiny cramped capsule, 3 people are trapped. Their fate now depends entirely on how precisely engineers calculated the strength of every single weld. The astronauts inside this capsule aren't just any passengers. They're the elite, the top test pilots of their era. These are people whose daily job was to land experimental fighters on the rocking decks of aircraft carriers in the dead of night during a storm. You'd think their nerves were made of steel cables, but what happens to the human body during a Saturn V launch goes far beyond anything they'd ever faced on Earth. The countdown begins. Flames flare beneath the rocket. This isn't the steady, rising hum of a passenger jet engine. It's a non-stop, artificially created earthquake. The sound waves from the exhaust pack such a physical punch that they slam into the crew's chest through the ship's hull in their suits, like a massive sledgehammer. The vibration travels through the metal frame, through the rigid seat mounts, straight into their bones. The shaking is so raw and chaotic that something unsettling happens. The pilots' eyeballs start resonating inside their skulls. Their vision simply shuts down. The cockpit blurs into a trembling gray haze right before their eyes. They physically can't read the instruments. They don't see the switches. They can't focus on the warning lights. In these critical seconds, when the difference between reaching orbit and fiery disaster hangs in the balance, the crew flies almost blind, relying solely on muscle memory and commands from mission control. Crushing this blinding vibration is a colossal overload. At launch, it soared to 4 times gravity, 4 times the weight of your own body. You lie on your back, strapped into your seat, trying to take a normal breath, but it feels like a full-grown bear is pressing down on your chest. Raising your hand to flip a switch demands the strength of a professional weightlifter. Blood drains from your head, and your heart races wildly, fighting to push oxygen through vessels squeezed tight. This isn't flying in the usual sense. It's a desperate battle to survive inside a mechanical beast that accelerates relentlessly, pressing people deeper into their seats with ruthless force. What's truly astonishing lies in how engineers managed to tame this destructive force, stopping the rocket from tearing itself apart right on the launch pad. The 5 F1 engines mounted at the base of the Saturn V are the most powerful single-chamber rocket engines ever built. Each one burns 3 tons of fuel every second. The turbopump, a machine the size of a compact car, spins under the unimaginable weight of a falling column of fuel. It drives liquid oxygen and kerosene into the combustion chamber at such intense pressure that ordinary metal would simply burst at the seams. If all 5 engines fired at exactly the same millisecond, disaster would strike. The acoustic shock and instant energy release would create a shockwave that bounces off the launch pad's concrete trench, then races back up, tearing apart 3,000 tons of thin-walled metal. The rocket would destroy itself with its own power, exploding into a massive fireball right there at Cape Canaveral. To prevent this, engineers found a solution that bordered on mathematical madness. Instead of firing simultaneously, the engines ignited in a cascade, each delayed by 200 milliseconds. 200 thousandths of a second. Your eye blinks slower than that. But in the extreme physics of rocketry, that invisible pause created a life-saving buffer. The first engine ignites, sending its acoustic waves sideways. Then, in an imperceptible instant, the second fires, followed by the third, fourth, and fifth. This tiny stagger in time spreads out the peak stress, preventing deadly resonance from ripping the fuel tank walls apart. Exactly 200 milliseconds separated a historic triumph from a catastrophe that would have reduced the launch complex and crew to dust. Surviving the intense vibrations on the launch pad is just the first challenge. The real physical ordeal awaits the crew high above, the moment the rocket stages separate. The rocket tears through thick layers of atmosphere, burning through hundreds of tons of fuel every minute. The first stage runs dry, its massive tanks turning into dead weight that must be jettisoned immediately. Suddenly, the F1 engines shut down with no gradual slowdown. You're strapped into your seat, crushed by 4 times Earth's gravity, your body pressed hard against the rigid support, Your muscles tense reflexively to their limit, then suddenly complete ringing silence. The massive acceleration drops to zero instantly. In a split second, the overload vanishes and an uncontrollable force throws you forward into the seatbelts. The human body, having just fought relentlessly against crushing weight, can't physically adjust fast enough. Then, without the slightest warning, the pyrotechnic bolts ignite. Explosive charges snap the massive, hollow first stage away with a deafening crack. Immediately after, the second stage engines roar to life, slamming you back into your seat. The jolt hits so hard it feels like two heavy trucks crashing head-on at highway speed. The risk of injury during stage separation was very real. One wrong tilt of the head inside the helmet, a shoulder strap not tightened enough, and an astronaut could easily suffer a broken collarbone, torn muscles, or a severe concussion mid-flight. This brutal assault on the human body kept coming, stage after stage, as the rocket punched through the atmosphere. No smoothness, no comfort, just raw, shattering kinetic force, knocking the breath out of you and testing every bone to its limit. This entire 360-foot tower, 3,000 tons of roaring metal, cascading explosions, blinding vibrations, and bone-crushing forces, existed for one single purpose: to break the dead grip of Earth's gravity and lift a tiny, incredibly precise payload hidden at the very top of this fiery pyramid. The Saturn V was a relentless forge hammer, pounding the anvil of gravity with primal fury. But at the tip of that hammer sat something that defied every idea of strength and reliability. A craft designed to land on the lunar surface and bring people safely back to orbit. The contrast is staggering. On one hand, you have the monstrous, earth-shaking power of the launch rocket. On the other, the lunar module's sheer, vulnerable fragility that almost feels unreal. Just moments ago, you saw astronauts slammed into their seats, their vision blurred by intense vibrations. The most powerful engines ever built by humans roared, shaking the ground for miles around. And all that hellish, mind-boggling machinery existed solely to gently deliver a fragile shell into the dead silence of space, something that would collapse under its own weight back on Earth. But what happens when this overwhelming force finally carries the most delicate, unusual, and downright strange craft ever built into orbit? Every vehicle on Earth follows strict, unbreakable laws of resistance from the surrounding medium. A high-speed passenger train racing along the tracks, a race car tearing through a circuit, a modern supersonic fighter jet, they all share one unmistakable visual trait. Their shapes are always smooth and sleek, resembling an elongated drop, a bullet, or a sharp blade. To us, air feels weightless and invisible in everyday life, but at high speeds it turns instantly into a dense, almost concrete-like wall. Engineers on Earth spend immense effort crafting perfectly streamlined forms that can slice through this invisible barrier. Every extra detail, each protruding antenna, rivet, or tiny bump on the hull, creates swirling air currents. They trigger turbulence, spark intense vibrations, and ruthlessly slow the ship down. Our instinctive sense of aerodynamics runs so deep that even science fiction stubbornly depicts space cruisers with massive wings, tail fins, and sharp noses. But reality tells a very different story. A true interplanetary vessel built solely to operate beyond Earth's atmosphere looks like a chaotic jumble of metal with parts jutting out in every direction. The lunar module didn't have an aerodynamic shape. It looked like an angular, oddly asymmetric metal spider, with 4 sprawling landing legs, exposed fuel tanks shaped like spheres, radars jutting out in every direction, ladders, and a tangled mess of wires. Visually, it didn't scream billions of dollars in cutting-edge technology. Instead, it resembled a strange, unfinished model, thrown together from random parts and packing paper. But here's the twist. This visual oddity was the ultimate expression of engineering brilliance. Space is absolute, ringing emptiness. The vacuum offers no resistance to a moving object. There's no headwind, no dense gas layers, no destructive friction against the hull. In this environment, the shape of a spacecraft doesn't affect its speed or maneuverability at all. There's no point in wasting precious weight-hiding fuel tanks inside a sleek fuselage. Outside, they create no aerodynamic drag. And there's no need for smooth transitions between compartments when you can just join them at right angles, saving dozens of pounds of metal. Engineers ruthlessly discarded all earthly ideas about beauty and proper lines. They kept only pure, 100% function. Every part of the lunar module sat exactly where it needed to be for maximum efficiency. Not a single gram of material was spent making the ship visually appealing to the public. The outside of this strange machine was wrapped generously in gleaming gold foil. But this wasn't decoration, nor an attempt to make the spacecraft look futuristic for TV cameras. It was mylar, a specialized multi-layered thermal insulation. The moon's surface has no atmosphere to soften sudden temperature swings. The side facing the merciless sun would instantly heat up beyond the boiling point of water. Meanwhile, the shadowed side plunged into freezing cold, close to the absolute chill of space. That gold foil acted like a perfect mirror, bouncing back the harsh solar radiation to keep the tiny cabin from turning into a blazing oven. Workers laid each fragile layer by hand, which made the module look crumpled, like a giant discarded candy wrapper. The contrast between the precise math of orbital mechanics and the spacecraft's rough, foil-wrapped appearance is truly striking. The battle for every gram in this project reached a near-absurd extreme. Launching cargo into orbit has always been expensive, but a lunar mission multiplied that cost by hundreds. Sending spare parts or water to a space station orbiting Earth is one thing. Getting cargo out of Earth's relentless gravitational grip, delivering it to another celestial body's orbit, gently lowering it to the surface, then lifting it back into space, that's a whole different challenge. Every extra kilogram on the lunar module meant adding tens of kilograms of fuel to slow it down and land safely. And that fuel had to be launched from Earth, requiring hundreds of kilograms of propellant in a massive booster rocket. It's a ruthless math pyramid, where the slightest extra weight at the top means building a rocket of impossible scale at the bottom. So the engineers behind the lunar module put their craft on the most extreme weight loss diet in human history. They cut everything that wasn't absolutely essential for the crew's survival during the few days of the mission. The first to go were the basic comforts of being human. The module had no seats, none at all. Not soft, not hard, not even foldable. To pilot this incredibly complex machine and make humanity's first landing on another world, the astronauts had to stand the entire time. Imagine yourself inside this cramped cockpit. The space feels no bigger than a phone booth, or a very tight closet. You're wearing a bulky, rigid spacesuit that weighs dozens of pounds and severely limits your movement. To keep your head from smashing into the control panel during sharp maneuvers in zero gravity or a hard landing, elastic tethers strap you firmly to the floor. These cords pull tight, pressing the soles of your heavy lunar boots against the metal deck. You stand with knees slightly bent, elbows resting on armrests, hands gripping the controls, balancing your entire body while the powerful landing engine beneath your feet roars, spewing flame as it tries to cancel out an enormous orbital speed. Skipping heavy metal seats, springs, and shock absorbers saved tens of precious pounds, but it turned flying this craft into a grueling test of endurance. But ditching the seats was just the tip of the iceberg in this fight against gravity. The real danger lurked in the very structure of the lunar module itself. Its walls, the only barrier keeping astronauts safe from the deadly freezing vacuum of space, were only a few millimeters thick. In some spots, the outer shell was as thin as 2 layers of heavy-duty aluminum foil. If you were inside this craft on Earth, you could accidentally pierce the wall with an ordinary screwdriver or even a hard, unlucky elbow jab. The metal had been milled down to a fragile sheet, almost like paper. Engineers used aggressive chemical treatments to shave off every unnecessary micron of aluminum from the panel interiors, obsessively stripping weight wherever the metal seemed excessive. This unsettling fragility wasn't a miscalculation or reckless oversight. The moon's surface lacks atmospheric pressure outside, nothing to crush the cabin inward, and the gravity is too weak to demand a heavy steel frame. Inside, pure oxygen pressure held steady at just a third of Earth's normal atmosphere. That meant the thin walls didn't have to withstand massive outward force. The module was engineered solely for the vacuum of space. If anyone tried to test it in a wind tunnel or push it through dense Earth air, the rushing flow would shred it to pieces within seconds. It was so light and delicate that, on Earth, many parts bent under their own weight, forcing technicians to use special supports during final assembly in the hangar. That's why the feeling of physical vulnerability inside this tiny cabin was absolutely overwhelming. These astronauts, used to the sturdy frames of experimental fighter jets, knew their lives depended on a shell barely stronger than a typical aluminum soda can. A stray micrometeoroid, no bigger than a grain of sand and hurtling through space at incredible speed, could pierce this thin foil in an instant. One wrong, sharp move with a heavy metal tool inside the cabin could cause a catastrophic loss of pressure. The crew had to maintain extraordinary discipline, every motion smooth and precise, almost surgical. Another major victim of extreme weight saving was the windows. They had to be small because glass is incredibly heavy and dense. Thick, multi-layered quartz portholes, designed to withstand pressure changes and the brutal cold of space, each weighed tens of pounds. On orbital space stations or ships built for long, month-long missions, windows are large. They help with visual navigation, docking, and offer crucial psychological relief to crews trapped inside cramped metal tubes. But the lunar module couldn't afford that kind of weight luxury. Its windows were microscopic, triangular, and set at a strange, unnatural angle, tilted sharply downward toward the floor. Engineers designed their size and shape with ruthless precision. The cockpit had just enough transparent glass for the pilot to spot the landing site in the final, critical seconds before touching down on the lunar surface. Not a square centimeter more. The triangular shape focused the view downward, removing heavy glass from the upper corners, places the pilot simply didn't need to look. To peer through those side windows, astronauts had to lean forward, pressing their bulky helmets almost flush against the glass. The view was painfully restricted. No wide horizon, no majestic panorama of space overhead, just a narrow slice, a tight frame of gray dust and craters rushing up from below. This confined space, with its ultra-thin foil walls, upright stance on taut cables, and the steady drone of life support systems, created a truly unique, isolated sensory world. Inside their suits, astronauts heard nothing but their own heavy breaths, the dry crackle of radio chatter from Earth, and the clicks of switches on the control panel. Outside sound simply didn't exist. When the landing engine fired beneath their feet at full throttle, blasting tons of superheated gas to slow the ship's descent, the silence outside remained absolute. Sound waves had nowhere to travel in the vacuum. All that immense energy and engine roar reached the crew only as faint, trembling vibrations, rippling up through the floor and into the soles of their boots. This golden capsule embodied the very essence of human boldness and cold pragmatism. The craft shed every unnecessary part, ugly by earthly standards, fragile to the extreme, but perfectly, exquisitely engineered for one singular historic mission. It had to detach from the command module high above the moon, descend on its own to the surface, let two astronauts step out into the gray dust, then use its own lower landing section as an improvised launch pad. Once the mission was complete, the upper cabin with the astronauts would fire away and return to orbit, leaving the landing stage standing alone in the lunar desert forever. That golden frame still rests there, a silent monument to incredible engineering ingenuity. Every switch on the control panel, every inch of copper wiring, every aluminum rivet in this remarkable spacecraft came from agonizing, sleepless compromises between crew safety and relentless weight limits. Engineers deliberately cut life support redundancies, risking the crew's lives, because Earth's massive launch rocket simply couldn't lift any heavier. This was functional minimalism at its peak. The beauty of this craft didn't lie in sleek, aerodynamic curves. It was in the astonishing fact that this fragile assembly of foil, wires, and thin metal actually worked. It carried humans to the most hostile, farthest world imaginable, survived the vacuum's brutal trials, and brought them back alive. The entire American lunar program hinged on paradoxical, all-or-nothing decisions. The Saturn V rocket's enormous, overwhelming power on the launch pad stood in stark contrast to the unsettling fragility of the lunar module at the end of that long journey. Engineers went all in, throwing out every conventional rule for building spacecraft. They coldly sacrificed basic comforts, strong armor, and heavy backup systems for one sole purpose: to be the first to set foot on the moon. They built a one-of-a-kind ship that didn't need air at all, and pushed it to complete its most delicate mission with surgical precision. But this historic space race wasn't just a solo sprint. While teams in the United States' sterile assembly rooms wrapped the angular cabins of lunar modules in shiny mylar halfway around the world, an equally intense battle of minds was unfolding. The Soviet Union was carving its own path to the moon's craters, wrestling with the same harsh laws of orbital mechanics and brutal weight limits. Yet their engineering approach to escaping Earth's gravity was completely different, staggering in both scale and technical complexity. If the Americans pushed their lunar module design to radical extremes to win, what kind of wild and ultimately fatal choice did their main rivals make with their engine designs across the ocean? Picture a sun-scorched steppe near Baikonur. It's the late 1960s. The air shimmers with heat, blurring the horizon. Meanwhile, American spy satellites orbit low overhead, snapping photos and sending them to Washington. These images chill military analysts to the bone. On the launch pad, surrounded by towers and cranes, stands a colossal machine, the Soviet N-1 Super Heavy rocket, the USSR's only answer to the American lunar race. Unlike the sleek, pencil-thin American Saturn V, our rocket looked different, an elegant cone tapering sharply upward. 105 meters tall, nearly 3,000 tons in weight, a mountain of metal, wiring, and volatile fuel. But its deepest secret, the one that sealed its tragic fate, lay hidden beneath the wide skirt of the first stage. The Soviet Union didn't have an engine like America's F-1. Building a single, massive combustion chamber that could burn tons of fuel steadily without destructive vibrations required time. Time for testing and research. Time they didn't have in the middle of the space race. Moscow demanded immediate results. The moon couldn't wait. So engineers took an unprecedented route. If they couldn't build one powerful engine, they would link many smaller, proven ones into a single system. That's how the bottom of the N-1 rocket ended up with 30 engines. 2 concentric rings, 24 around the outside, 6 in the center. 30 fiery hearts, all meant to beat in perfect sync, lifting that steel giant off the ground. Trying to combine 30 powerful engines into a tight cluster turned into uncontrollable physical chaos. Each engine roared like a volcano, pumping hundreds of kilograms of liquid oxygen and kerosene every second. The turbopump spun at insane speeds, blades howling, combustion chambers blasting flames thousands of degrees hot. Every engine produced its own unique high-frequency vibration. Now imagine 30 of them, all rigidly fixed to a single frame. These vibrations didn't just add up. They overlapped, resonated, and sparked acoustic shockwaves of unpredictable force. This deadly tremor raced instantly through the rocket's structure, targeting its most vulnerable point, the fuel lines. Inside those pipes, a lethal hydrodynamic shock emerged. Pressurized fluid began to pulse. Pressure spikes hammered the pipe walls and valves like a blacksmith's hammer. The metal fatigued, cracked, and tore open mid-flight. The fuel system turned into a tangled web of pulsating arteries, ready to rupture and flood the scorching turbines with pure oxygen. To grasp the full horror of this engineering trap, imagine a large symphony orchestra. On stage, 30 drummers wield heavy instruments. Their mission: strike the drumhead absolutely simultaneously, with precision down to 1,000th of a second. And not just once, like Ian, they have to keep this complex machine gun rhythm going perfectly for several minutes. If even one drummer lags behind or strikes too hard, the perfect wave shatters into chaos. Now, let's raise the stakes to the level of a Soviet lunar rocket. Blindfold all 30 musicians. Remove the conductor. Put noise-canceling headphones on each of them so they can't hear one another. Then make them play that rhythm during a 9-magnitude earthquake, while the stage trembles violently beneath their feet. This is exactly the hellish environment where the first stage engines operated. Each engine had its own personality, its own tiny ignition delay, its own distinct thrust curve. No two mechanisms were perfectly alike. Some turbines spun up slightly slower, others surged into operation with a jolt. This mechanical discord, combined with intense vibration, turned a stable launch into a deadly mathematical challenge. This is where the toughest limitation of that era came into play. Analog systems simply couldn't synchronize 30 engines at the precise speeds required. That was the ceiling for the electronics back then. Today, your smartphone processes trillions of operations every second. Back then, machines relied on relays, bundles of cables, and basic semiconductors. Engineers knew the cluster design carried risks, so they built the Cordy control system. It had to monitor pressure and temperature at every engine in real time. If one engine faltered, the system had to shut it down instantly. And to keep the rocket from tipping over, Cord had to disable the exact opposite engine on the ring's other side. On paper, it all made perfect sense. Perfect. But in reality, the electrical signals traveled too slowly through the long cables. The sensors went haywire from the vibrations, sending out erratic readings. While the electronics struggled to process the data and relays clicked to shut the valves, precious fractions of a second slipped away. In rocket engineering, a fraction of a second can feel like forever. By the time the command reached its target, the pump had already exploded into shrapnel, tearing apart adjacent pipes while flames engulfed the rear section, turning the rocket into a flying bomb. The N-1 program ended in 4 disasters, 4 launches, 4 fiery explosions lighting up the Kazakh steppe. The worst came during the second launch on a warm July night in 1969. The rocket lifted off but climbed only 200 meters. Then, a fatal failure erupted in the tail section. Vibrations blinded the control system, which only made things worse by randomly shutting down almost all the engines. 3,000 tons of metal, loaded with explosive fuel, crashed back onto the launch pad. The blast lit up the steppe like a second sun rising. Shockwaves shattered windows miles away. The launch complex was leveled to bare concrete. This wasn't just a loss of hardware, it was a devastating psychological blow to the thousands of minds pushing to their limits. Rushing and political pressure didn't just break metal, they shattered lives. Remember cosmonaut Komarov's death aboard the unfinished Soyuz spacecraft? They sent him on a deadly mission just to meet a political deadline. The same bureaucratic machine pushed the lunar program forward, forcing a raw rocket launch without proper testing. Later, this bitter story repeated itself when the Energia Buran program was shut down, burying the work of an entire generation of engineers under the rubble of shifting political and economic realities. The most astonishing part of this grim story is that, half a century later, this cursed concept has suddenly come back to life. SpaceX's modern Super Heavy Starship rocket uses the exact same engineering approach on its first stage. 33 engines, 33 nozzles packed tightly together under the belly. And today, they actually work. What was impossible for the analog systems of the 60s has become routine for digital technology. Tiny microprocessors scan thousands of sensors millions of times per second. Smart controllers predict pressure spikes microseconds before a failure and instantly adjust fuel flow. An invisible digital brain has become the perfect conductor for this fiery orchestra of 33 blind drummers. A historic mistake that cost the Soviet Union its lunar dream has evolved, thanks to computer advances, into a technological triumph paving the way to deep space. But if the USSR tragically failed with 30 engines, while modern engineers master 33 and solve synchronization, then why does today's plan to return humans to the moon demand a paradoxical 15 orbital refuelings for just one single spacecraft? A giant steel tower shudders. It tears away from the launch pad and slowly crawls upward. Dozens of nozzles roar, scorching the concrete beneath. The structure climbs 10 kilometers high, then begins a complex flip maneuver, only to suddenly lose control and erupt into a blinding fireball. Burning fragments of the hull rain down into the ocean. Back in the 1960s, a scene like this would have shut down the entire program instantly. Government investigations would follow, along with national disgrace. The pioneers of spaceflight triple-checked every formula with slide rules, measured every millimeter of their blueprints, because the cost of failure was just too high. Every glitch meant disaster. Today, that mindset has shifted completely. At the Mission Control Center, people leap to their feet and cheer as the rocket explodes. This isn't mass hysteria. It's a completely different, practical approach to engineering. A philosophy of iterative design through destruction. Instead of spending decades perfecting blueprints in sterile labs and fearing the slightest risk, SpaceX's engineers quickly build a prototype, launch it, push it to its physical limits, and watch closely to see exactly where the design breaks down. The machine fails, yes, but before it shatters, it sends back gigabytes of invaluable telemetry data. Engineers use these raw numbers to make the next prototype a little stronger, a little smarter, a little more reliable. Over and over, this process repeats until the Silver Beast learns to fly flawlessly. This method drives progress at astonishing speed, turning failure into the stepping stones of a technological leap. This aggressive approach reshaped the entire concept of lunar missions. The Starship slated to land on the moon's surface isn't a tiny capsule. It's a towering steel giant standing 50 meters tall. Inside, spacious cabins stretch out alongside massive cargo bays, robust life support systems, and heavy scientific instruments. Compared to last century's lunar module, a fragile frame of foil and slender pipes, This craft resembles a full-sized ocean liner next to a flimsy fishing boat. Starship will touch down on the moon as a single massive silver monolith, resting firmly on its powerful landing legs. Here lies the ultimate engineering trap. Launching such a massive object off Earth and into orbit demands an astronomical amount of energy. The ship's fuel tanks are enormous, yet by the time it reaches low Earth orbit, they're almost empty. Every drop of fuel burns away in a fierce battle against gravity. The huge spacecraft drifts in space, but it's utterly helpless, like a heavy truck stranded on a highway with an empty gas tank. It needs a refuel. Imagine sitting in the command chair of the Artemis mission's chief logistics officer. You stare at the charts flickering on the monitors and feel the chilling weight of the challenge ahead. Your main ship drifts in orbit, empty and cold. To fuel it for the final push to the moon, you need to send up propellant. A lot of propellant. A single full Starship flight demands 15 orbital refills. 15 heavy rockets must launch one after another from the spaceport, reach that exact orbit, locate the empty ship, dock with it, and pump in their share of liquefied gas. The operation turns into an endless logistical nightmare. The launch window opens for just a few minutes each day. Then the coastal weather turns sour, a fierce wind picks up, and the launch gets scrubbed. Meanwhile, physics works relentlessly in orbit. Cryogenic fuel, supercooled liquid oxygen and methane, can't last forever in space. The sun heats the steel walls of the tanks, causing the icy liquid inside to boil and turn into gas. To prevent the tanks from bursting under pressure, engineers have to vent this precious gas into the vacuum of space. The fuel literally evaporates before your eyes. Delay tanker launches by a week because of a storm, and half of the already transferred supply simply vanishes. This demands a flawless, non-stop launch schedule, where there's no room for a sensor failure, an assembly delay, or a navigation mistake. One glitch can topple the entire fragile chain. The reason behind this chaotic logistical dance lies in the most significant achievement of modern spaceflight. The mass trap snaps shut precisely where reusability begins. Apollo spacecraft were strictly single-use, and that's where their brutal, brilliant efficiency came from. The massive rocket discarded spent stages one after another, dropped empty fuel tanks, and shed heavy engines for good. By the time it approached lunar orbit, just a tiny shell weighing a few dozen tons remained out of the original 3,000 tons at liftoff. The engineers of the 60s never dragged extra weight through space. Starship, however, is designed as a fully reusable system, and that reusability comes at a steep cost. The ship can't jettison its tanks. It hauls a heavy steel shell back and forth. It drags thousands of ceramic black heat shield tiles, needed for just one crucial moment, re-entering Earth's dense atmosphere on the way home. The rest of the time, these tiles hang like dead weight, like a heavy winter coat someone carries through a scorching desert, simply because they'll need it a month later. On top of that, reusability demands carrying the weight of landing fuel to touch down gently on a concrete pad at the mission's end. This massive ballast means Starship's basic energy efficiency ironically falls short of the one-time use Apollo. The modern craft spends an enormous effort just hauling itself around. Now, picture a low Earth orbit where this unprecedented operation is about to unfold. Against the pitch-black sky, framed by the blue and white curve of the planet, a line of massive silver cylinders forms. A fleet of 15 tankers circles the Earth, each one there to refuel a single lunar spacecraft. It looks like a surreal traffic jam, but in the vacuum of space. These enormous machines, each as tall as a 20-story building, must carefully close in on each other at 28,000 kilometers per hour. Their metallic docking rings align with millimeter precision. Locks click shut with a muted thud. And then begins a process that seasoned aerospace veterans greet with deep skepticism. Transferring cryogenic fuel in space on this scale has never been done before. In weightlessness, liquid behaves unpredictably. It doesn't settle quietly at the bottom of a tank. Instead, it clings to the walls, forming chaotic bubbles and thick foam. To make the icy liquid methane flow through pipes the right way, spacecraft fire brief pulses from their engines, creating artificial microgravity. Pumps roar as they move hundreds of tons of substance chilled to minus 160 degrees. Meanwhile, harsh solar radiation beats down on the hull. One wrong move, one tiny crack in a seal, and a jet of oxygen could burst out, sending the massive linked vessels spinning in a deadly, uncontrolled whirl. 15 refueling stops add up to a brutal mathematical reality, one that exposes the incredible fragility of today's lunar program. Every new component chips away at the chance of success for any complex technical system. In the last century, launching a moon rocket was a single solid event. The machine took off, worked through its critical minutes, and the crew set their course. Now, the mission breaks down into 16 separate high-stakes launches, one main ship and 15 tankers. Even if each launch boasts an optimistic 99% success rate, multiplying that probability 16 times in a row sends the overall chance of a flawless mission plummeting. The technology has to perform perfectly 16 times in a row. The weather has to be perfect 16 times. Docking systems can't fail during any of the 15 connections. Transfer valves must open and close hundreds of times without ever freezing shut in the brutal cold of space. This is a logistical tightrope walk stretched over a bottomless abyss. Experts constantly solve complex heat exchange equations, calculating exactly how many tons of fuel will evaporate in orbit while the next tanker prepares for launch. This supply chain is so long, so intricate, and so fragile that many specialists openly call it the Achilles heel of the entire mission to bring humanity back to the moon. To grasp just how monumental this is, we need to look back at the story of exploring Antarctica. In the early 20th century, Amundsen and Scott's expeditions pushed themselves to the absolute limits of human endurance to reach the South Pole. They relied on a brutal, one-shot approach. Dogs hauled heavy sleds across the icy plateau. When the animals grew too weak to continue, they were slaughtered and fed to the remaining dogs, and to the exhausted men themselves. It was ruthless, terrifying, but astonishingly effective at reaching a single point on a blank map. They planted their flag, took a historic photo, and left behind nothing but tracks, quickly swallowed by the drifting snow. The Apollo program was exactly that kind of expedition, a daring leap, pushing technology to its limits. It stripped away everything unnecessary, focusing solely on survival and winning a political race. But today, no one in Antarctica eats dogs. Instead, massive research stations stand firm. Nuclear icebreakers carve through frozen seas. Heavy transport planes land on icy runways. Scientists ride warm, all-terrain tracked vehicles. SpaceX's Starship architecture, with its complex logistics and 15 orbital refuelings, aims to skip the era of cramped, heroic survival. It's a bold effort to build a powerful transport system for a permanent presence. We aren't designing a sleek racing car to break a record once. We're building a heavy-duty freight truck for regular runs. But if going back to the moon today is so much harder, more expensive, and demands an entire orbital infrastructure, carrying huge risks like boiling methane, then why are we even going there? 11 kilometers per second. That's the raw, physical speed at which a crewed capsule crashes into the upper atmosphere, returning from deep space. No need for complex equations to grasp this scale. It's 10 times faster than a sniper's bullet. At that speed, the trip from New York to Los Angeles takes just about 10 minutes. While outside, a plasma storm rages, hotter than the surface of the sun. This absolute record for a manned vehicle was set back in 1968 during the return of the first lunar missions. Since then, no human has ever traveled faster anywhere in the universe. More than half a century has passed, technology has advanced at an astonishing pace, and computing power has exploded by millions. Yet, that insane speed barrier remains unbroken. You'd think progress would push us toward faster speeds, farther records, but reality tells a different story. The course of space exploration has shifted dramatically. The era of bold, desperate records, smashing speed limits just for a headline, has vanished. The last century's program was a grand political sprint. The goal was simple: cross the finish line first, plant your flag in the dusty gray surface, capture that historic image, and come home alive no matter what. Today, the mission looks very different. Humanity no longer chases speed records or brief tourist jaunts. We've entered a grueling marathon era where the priority is to settle in, survive, and build self-sustaining infrastructure on the most hostile frontier we can reach. The reason for such a brutal return lies deep within the eternally dark craters at the moon's south pole. That's where the ultimate prize of the new space race waits. The resource driving the construction of massive reusable spacecraft: water ice. At first glance through a telescope, the moon looks like a dry, lifeless rock, hanging motionless in the void. But its poles hold unique regions where direct sunlight hasn't touched for billions of years. Temperatures in these black, bottomless pits drop to minus 240 degrees Celsius. The ice there is frozen so solid it's harder than Earth's granite. This resource instantly changes the entire game, turning a barren satellite into the most valuable real estate in our solar system. Water in space isn't just about quenching the crew's thirst. It's a versatile, priceless resource. When electricity passes through ice, it breaks down into oxygen for breathing and hydrogen, the perfect, powerful rocket fuel. Launching heavy water tanks from Earth costs an unbearable amount. Every pound of cargo demands burning dozens of pounds of fuel just to escape Earth's gravity. But if you have your own glacier right at an orbital station, the moon instantly turns into a massive cosmic gas station. Picture this. You stand at the edge of a polar crater, suited up in a heavy spacesuit. The landscape around you deceives the eye. Because the moon is much smaller than Earth, the horizon drops off surprisingly close. This creates strange optical illusions. Take this example. A lunar rover drives away from its base, its wheels kicking up fountains of gray dust. After just 2.5 miles, the vehicle completely disappears behind the horizon, as if sinking beneath the surface. Imagine there are only 2 of you and the entire planet is yours, but no one can help. Around you, only the ringing silence of the vacuum stretches out, along with the chilling realization that the nearest rescue team lies 380,000 miles away across empty space. Extracting ice in these conditions isn't just a tough scientific challenge, it's a daily, grueling fight to survive. The surface of our moon is both a radiation furnace and a cosmic shooting range. Unlike Earth, the moon lacks a thick atmosphere and a protective magnetic field, those invisible shields that guard us every second. When the sun unleashes a powerful flare, a deadly storm of charged particles floods the lunar landscape, powerful enough to pierce right through the human body. On top of that, micrometeorite showers constantly bombard the surface, striking at incredible speeds without any warning. But the harshest challenge lies beneath your feet, the lunar regolith. This isn't soft beach sand, smoothed by waves or wind. It's made up of billions of microscopic shards of glass and rock, razor-sharp fragments forged by countless meteorite impacts. Static electricity makes this omnipresent gray dust stick firmly to everything. It seeps into the tiniest gaps in machinery, destroys moving joints, eats away rubber seals, and tears through tough fabrics. Living on the surface in lightweight glass domes with panoramic views, as colorful sci-fi movies often show, is simply impossible. Real colonization demands moving underground immediately. This is the reality behind future mission plans. Heavy autonomous tractors crawl slowly across the gray desert, scooping tons of abrasive regolith with their steel buckets. They methodically bury the metal living modules beneath a thick layer of lunar sand, several meters deep. Only massive, heavy armor made from solid rock can block harsh cosmic radiation and absorb the kinetic impacts of micrometeoroids. Future colonists will become high-tech miners, living inside cramped metal tubes buried beneath layers of radioactive dust. They'll venture onto the deadly surface only when critical repairs or maintenance demand it. Surviving in this harsh new environment demands more than massive reusable rockets and deep underground bunkers. It calls for flawless personal protection. A spacesuit for the lunar surface isn't just high-tech clothing. It's a fully autonomous spacecraft, tailored precisely to the human body. It must keep you warm in the shadows, cool under the blazing sun, maintain life-saving pressure, and shield against micrometeorite impacts. And here's the twist. The key to space ended up in the hands of a sewing factory. Back in the era of the first space flights, the job of crafting this critical armor didn't fall to tough metallurgist engineers at military plants. Instead, it went to a company that had spent decades specializing in women's lingerie. It was ordinary seamstresses, accustomed to working with delicate, stretchable corset fabrics, who crafted a true marvel of engineering. The lunar spacesuit featured 25 layers of advanced materials. These included tough nylon, flexible neoprene, fire-resistant Teflon, and reflective aluminized mylar. Every stitch had to be sewn by hand with obsessive precision. Even a tiny snag, a forgotten pin, or a thread off by just a millimeter could cause instant explosive decompression and certain death for the astronaut in the vacuum of space. These soft, multi-layered suits saved lives, but wearing them turned into a grueling ordeal. Under oxygen pressure, the suit hardened like an inflated car tire. Every movement, even the simplest one, demanded enormous effort. The hands suffered the most. Inside the gloves, inflated by pressure, fingers met fierce resistance with every bend. To grip the handle of a geological hammer, astronauts had to fight against the stubborn stiffness of the material again and again. After hours of this exhausting work on the surface, they returned to the lunar module completely drained. The physical pain was so sharp and unbearable that after missions, their fingernails would come off from relentless rubbing and pressure against the glove tips. Space shows no mercy. It claims a bloody toll for every step taken on foreign ground. Today, the stakes in this global game have skyrocketed. New, incredibly ambitious players have stepped onto the stage, backed by massive budgets. The monopoly on deep space is finally over. China has officially set a goal to land its astronauts on the moon by the year 2030. That date acts like an unyielding deadline for the entire global scientific community. A rapid reshuffling of territories is underway, places not even marked on detailed political maps of Earth yet. Take the South Pole, for example. It holds priceless reserves of ice, but the truly usable sites are extremely limited. Here, patches of eternal shadow, rich in resources, sit right next to towering peaks bathed in constant sunlight, essential for powering solar panels around the clock. Whoever claims these unique strategic heights first will gain an absolute, undeniable edge in shaping the entire future of lunar economy. This isn't some romantic scientific expedition hunting for pretty rocks or national pride. It's a pragmatic battle for resources, cutting-edge survival technologies, and the right to set the rules on humanity's new, endless frontier. That's why today's engineers keep tackling impossible challenges, landing massive steel towers on roaring jet streams, planning to pump hundreds of tons of boiling methane in orbit, and building heavy autonomous tractors designed to work in the vacuum. Humanity is returning to this harsh, gray world, coated in glassy sand, ready to stay there. This time for good.